This past weekend, Ghostface has returned to the silver screen for the first time in over 10 years. But was their return worth the wait? Let's find out. The newest chapter in the Scream series has finally arrived with a new cast of characters to be killed, but also do some killing of their own. Now, despite the fact that this film is being made 6 years after the death of horror mastermind behind the original Scream films, Wes Craven, still really above any other horror franchise, this series makes the most sense to me to resurrect. Not to say that the Scream series is even my favorite out of its slasher peers, but given the state of things in Hollywood and how much horror and fandom has evolved over the years, I really can't think of a series more adept to take on these tasks of criticizing what we are seeing in films nowadays and in film communities. But simply addressing these trends that we are seeing isn't really enough in my book. My true hope for this film is that it wasn't just going to be a simple acknowledgement of these tropes, but truly a commentary or a subversion of a lot of these ideas. See, the Scream series as a whole, for myself, has struggled with the idea and this concept of lampshading. Oftentimes in these movies, they talk about the tropes in slasher films, but despite that fact, they don't always do anything to actively subvert these ideas. Except for Sidney Prescott as a fine little girl, who really has been the star of this series next to the Masked Killer. So if Paramount is going to bring back this series and offer another chapter in the Scream saga, this film can't just be another Scream film with the same old, same old. What else can you offer me? And what does this movie have to say? But thankfully, I think this new film is a lot of fun. And although it still sticks to the playbook in a lot of ways, because this film delivers on the humor, the horror, and overall wit and commentary this movie offers in regards to not just horror films, but the state of movies in general, makes this film stand out more than just being kind of a soulless cash grab. I think one of the primary appeals of a Scream movie, which has always made this series set itself apart from other franchises in the genre, are the characters and the solving of the mystery of who this killer could be. Because in a lot of ways, this series has always been this Scooby-Doo for adults, where this series goes as far as in the third film, it ends at a big mansion with secret doors and spinning bookshelves. But with each film, they do stick to a certain kind of formula in a way. Each film mostly ends in the same way, and through that journey, there are certain red herrings and plot points that most of the Scream films include. Despite the fact this series is known for calling out the tropes and cliches found within horror films and in the slasher subgenre, I think arguably this series has adhered to a pretty strict playbook far more than Nightmare on Elm Street or Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Friday the 13th or Child's Play, more so. This series has sort of always had its cake and eaten it too in that regard, which was why I was so happy to see that in a lot of ways this movie not only subverts those tropes, but in some other cases kind of doubles down on them in an almost ironic way. See, the original Scream film has become this transcendent piece of horror and was really one of those movies like something like The Matrix or Die Hard, where producers in Hollywood just said, hey, just try and make that movie for the next 15 years. And so when you have a film like this new Scream, which is coming out in a time where Hollywood is still trying to breathe new life into series like Halloween or Star Wars or Ghostbusters or whatever, there is this sense of legacy that is being dealt with, right? Particularly in regards to those films, which include core members from the original film brought back in a modern context. Yes, of course, Sidney and Gale and Dewey have always been a major part of this series, but this film puts them in a unique position as opposed to the prior films. See, in this film, they are referred to as the legacy characters, essentially meaning that they are there to assist these new characters who are introduced into stepping into the spotlight. And if things go well, maybe they'll slowly start to kind of take over the series and become the new face of Scream. Think of it like Han Solo's relationship with Rey in The Force Awakens, or Laurie Strode in Halloween. These characters come back. They're a little bit more seasoned, they have some more wrinkles and gray in their hair, there, but they've still got it deep down inside. They've been through this before, so they are able to offer some wisdom to this newer generation. Hell, this film even does that same thing that Halloween did and just doesn't change the title from the original movie, which for the record, I hate so much, which is one of the many things that makes this film unique from some of the other entries into the Scream franchise. See, a lot of films in this series obviously serve as a commentary on horror, which this film does too, but a lot of what this film has to say about horror specifically is mostly in regards to the first Scream film. And aside from a few jabs about the idea of elevated horror and how that is kind of the new cool hip thing as opposed to something kind of more cheesy or schlocky or whatever, like a slasher film from the 80s or 90s, but for the most part, this movie is addressing the impact a film like Scream can have and the types of fans a film with that much legacy can cultivate, which is honestly not exclusive to the horror genre, unfortunately. Now, I'm going to discuss something this film addresses, and I know taking one look at the things around me, you may feel like I am stretching a bit, but I promise it's not some hidden message in this movie. It is all but said by name. But this film has a lot to say about toxic fandom, particularly those found within a franchise that comes from legendary beginnings that is not unlike the type of legacy and fandom that Star Wars has generated. And I know that it might be easy to look around at things in this room and be like, gee, shocker, Garrett's talking about Star Wars again, but bear with me here. Not only does this film have the very Han Solo and Force Awakens vibes that I discussed earlier and the idea of bringing back these legacy characters and using them as like a jumping off point for these new characters who are introduced, not only is that element in this film, but this movie directly mentions how someone like Rian Johnson, or the guy who directed Knives Out as he is referred to in this movie, can come along and make a film that takes the series in a different direction, and how adverse fans are to the idea of change, to the thing that they love, and how no matter what happens or choices filmmakers make, nothing can compare to the originals. I'll talk about that idea specifically in just a moment, but that sense of entitlement that fans can have, this film directly addresses that toxicity, which actually was the biggest surprise by far that this movie had to offer. And the way that this film was able to take down that attitude of just, do you really love originality as much as you think you do? Or do you just want to see the thing that you used to love kind of just done again and repurposed and repackaged? It's such a surprising angle for this movie to take, and one that I honestly thought was a brilliant choice. Now, despite the fact that I love the ideas this film addresses about fandom and toxicity like I discussed, I think on the whole, this film does make a lot of similar points and actually has a number of plot points specifically that are pretty much Scream 4, which is the movie that is directly prior to this film. See, that film was made in a time where a ton of horror franchises were coming back. In the 2000s and early 2010s, reboots and remakes had already been made of Friday the 13th, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Black Christmas, My Bloody Valentine, Halloween, Prom Night. That's just to name the slashers alone. So when Scream 4 comes along, it really is a film that examines a new killer's, desire to not only live up to the legacy of the original film, but also step out from its shadow and become perhaps even more famous. As I said, the angle this film takes on toxic fandoms and the entitlement found within that, that's so well done. But it does so in a way that sort of recycles some plot points and commentary that was made by the fourth film too. And if there's one thing that I won't stand for, it's Scream 4 erasure. I simply won't have it. But there are a few other new elements that this film does introduce to the series, one of which would be a whole new batch of teenagers Ghostface has the opportunity to terrorize, as well as this newfound sense of brutality that this film has with some of these kills. My God. See, the Scream franchise has never really showcased its kills as theatrically as something like Friday the 13th, or especially A Nightmare on Elm Street. Of course, there are a few kills and set pieces of note in this series, but this franchise has always been pretty cut and dry when it comes to its kills. But this film really does turn up the gore with this film. There are some mean and gruesome kills in this movie, which I could see going either way with fans. I know that there are a lot of diehard horror nuts who hate when kills get more violent compared to the original movie in the franchise, like Halloween compared to Halloween Kills for a recent example. I don't even know if hardcore Scream fans are upset with this or a little disappointed that this film is a bit more violent than its predecessors. But regardless, even if horror fans aren't upset, I think that this movie misses the opportunity to address why it's so much more mean and brutal. Because the idea that modern horror films and slashers can turn up the violence and really be so gory, especially compared to the 1980s, where a lot of those films were sort of tame or silly by today's standards, and now audiences are able to kind of stomach a lot more. Obviously, violence has always been a part of this series. I'm not saying that this is like PG, movies for kids here, but this violence that is found in this movie is considerably more ramped up than it was in some of its predecessors. And something else that has always been a big part of this franchise are the characters. Like I said up top, it's a series that has always been really unique compared to some of its peers in that, for the most part, these films are able to be about the same people, where the rest of the cast is sort of shuffled in and out so that we have a list of suspects as to who the killer may be. And of course, the last movie killed a lot of those people, so you kind of have to introduce some new ones so that Ghostface can have people to kill, so you can solve that mystery. And by this film's own admission, the new batch of characters that are introduced in this movie may or may not be the new faces for this franchise. And if that is the case, and these characters are going to be the new Sidney Prescott or Gale Weathers in a way, I would have liked to get a lot more out of this group, particularly from the supporting characters. The two main players in this film, being this young girl and her sister, these two felt considerably more developed than their co-stars, to the point where these other characters are just kind of, sort of there too, or are just kind of new versions of characters that we've seen prior. Normally, I wouldn't really care if they aren't that developed because it's a slasher movie and it's not, Shakespeare. A lot of these characters are meant to just kind of be like human pincushions in a way, and it's never been one of Scream's strong suits, especially in some of its sequels. But if these people are supposed to carry this franchise on their shoulders going forwards, I would have liked to have seen a bit more from them, which I don't even think is like a huge complaint. It's a little bit of a compliment, in fact. I want to spend more time with these characters. I wanted to get to know them a little bit more, and I think it's a shame that we didn't really have the opportunity to in this movie. Now, despite the fact that I think that, all in all, I do think that there is a ton of fun to be had with Scream. This movie, in a lot of ways, respects and embodies this entire series so well. In some ways, it has a lot of astute observations to make about Hollywood and the horror genre, while also kind of embracing a lot of these slasher tropes and habits within this very series. But it is pretty clear here that this is done with a lot of respect towards the original film and what Wes Craven was able to do with this series. And I think if you are a fan of the Scream franchise, you really are going to enjoy this newest entry. So did you guys see Scream? I'd love to know where it ranks for you in regards to the films in this series. Make sure you comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching today. I hope you liked today's video. And if you did, you can also click the link down below where you can subscribe to my channel to see more movie reviews and movie related things. Again, guys, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.